Welcome, everyone. Just want to make sure if everyone's got me on audio. Amanda, can you just confirm? And then everyone can see my first slide. Amanda, you want to? Yeah, okay, awesome. All right. So welcome, everyone, to our webinar around Copilot. We've got a few series of these happening. I was on one, I think, a couple of months ago, and then I had some really smart colleagues present one last month as well. And so we kind of hope to have this going. There's a lot happening in this space. We're going to go through that agents piece a little bit, and I think it's a bit of a logical direction in terms of where all these webinars have kind of taken us so far. We kind of started off with chat, and now we're in that agent space, right? So I don't expect this to take all of the hour, especially if you're out near the West Coast, whereas I am in Calgary. It is over the lunch hour, so I want to kind of be mindful of giving folks some time back at the top of the hour. My name is Shahab. I am a senior architect in our digital workspace practice. I've been doing things around bots now for, say, about 5 years. So pre-Copilot, you could do bots before Copilot came along. It's hard to believe, but you could. And I've been kind of working on this Copilot piece since it started, right? So that's been, let's say now roughly 2 years or so. So we'll talk about agents in a bit of greater depth, and we'll kind of take you through the basics of creating one. And then it's unlikely that we'll cover everything that we want to cover in any one call, but just kind of leave you something where you can explore on your own, or if you want more information, you can come through, right? So we'll talk about what an AI agent is, and we'll talk about why it matters, right? So the generative AI piece, the Copilot piece, and where agents can fit into all of that. We'll build our first agent. So there's a series of videos that we'll kind of go through that show step by step in terms of how we're building out that agent. We'll talk about agents in Copilot Chat. So you don't need effectively the $30 US per month license to buy to start using agents. So we'll talk about that. And also leave you guys with an exciting news, because I think it's being rolled out as we speak, and I think that changes a lot in terms of that space and what we can do with agents. And then finally, we'll talk about how CDW has helped other customers and how CDW can help you guys with this journey. So first and foremost, I don't think it's news to anyone that entire industries were disrupted when cloud computing came out, software as a service became this new normal thing. And I think AI is kind of doing the same thing in terms of how organizations engage with customers, develop products, empower employees, right? This is both in the public sector and also in the private sector, right? And one of the reasons for that is that AI has kind of created this new way of creating software and services. AI learns from us instead of being like explicitly programmed. So it can kind of gain a sense of what's happening in this world and then extract knowledge from it and reason on top of it, right? So just like software transformed every industry, AI is now transforming businesses. And if we haven't gotten there anyway, I feel every organization in the near future will have strong component of AI kind of powering their new innovations and developments that are coming up. Right? Now, within that AI sphere, you've got M365 Copilot, right? So it's almost been 2 years since it became available, and what it started off with to where it is now, I think that's night and day. I think it's also important to recognize that it is that UI for AI. I don't know if you guys recently heard this, but now you have access to Anthropic models also through Copilot. So you've always had access to the OpenAI models; those are still available. But then you've also got that Anthropic model piece, right? So it's not so Microsoft effectively moving into that agnostic sphere around Copilot, where you bring your own models or use any of the publicly available models, and then it marries it with through Graph with your data and puts that enterprise data protection piece all around it, right? So MT65 Copilot is effectively becoming that UI for AI. And then I would say more recently, I think there's been a shift in terms of how Copilot and agents have kind of worked through, right? So left-hand side, the Copilot piece, that's where mostly all of our delivery engagements were, I would say, right up to last year. Um, that is very much around personal productivity, right? And so it's about how I do things personally as an employee and how I can do them better or more effectively by using the power of generative AI. And so that's very much the Copilot's affair. Agents is something different. Agents is about automating tasks and processes, right? And so agents can augment Copilot with skills and knowledge. And agents can also exist um, independently in a vacuum to kind of provide that automation piece, right? And the example that I like to talk about is having a smartphone and having apps on it, right? So if you have if everyone has their own smartphone, like I have a smartphone and Amanda has a smartphone. We have different smartphones, but these are our own personal smartphones. But you might have the same applications on it. And we can put a bunch of different applications on it. So I might have the Expedia app, and then Amanda might have the Expedia app. But then we would be using them differently for the same process, which is booking travel, right? And just like there are significantly more applications than smartphones, there are going to be significantly more agents than people, right? So Copilot is that smartphone, that UI for AI, and then the agents kind of plug into it as those applications based on that business process that you're kind of trying to undertake as part of that job. Now you might have different processes that you're involved in at workplace, and so then therefore you'll be interacting with those different agents. Now, we've talked about those Copilot agents piece and kind of how they work. There is a broad spectrum in terms of how you can create those agents, right? And so if we start on the left-hand side, and so it formerly used to be known as Agent Builder, now it's known as Copilot Studio Lite. So if you see any of those designations within Microsoft materials, you'll know it's kind of talking about the same thing. And as we move from the left to the right, you'll see a change in terms of what I call the 4 Cs, right? So firstly, in terms of complexity, right? So anything that you do here is fairly easy, fairly basic. If you have a user who can make macros, who can write Outlook rules, they already can do this. So from a complexity perspective, this is fairly simple. From a cost perspective, it's also fairly cheap. It's kind of included with your MT65 piece. From a capability piece, you can't really do much with it, right? If you want to kind of look at even configuring some of those elements like we'll do today, yeah, Copilot Studio Lite is not going to kind of help you with that. So complexity, capability, and yeah, control, right? So you don't really have much control in terms of what's happening, right? So in terms of models, in terms of what you can do with these, it can't really do much, right? And I'll also maybe just talk about this piece. So declarative agents are tools that are enhancing your MT65 Copilot experience, right? So they're combining knowledge and skills, and we'll talk about some of those like actions and triggers and workflows to kind of create that experience. And they can be integrated back into MT65 through connectors advanced features, right? And these can be through API plugins or and they can show up in Teams or kind of all of those elements, right? Now, M365 piece, again, like I said, can be connected to agents, but these agents can exist outside that as well, right? And then within that sphere, if you're looking to create more configuration around those agents, if you're looking to get more control, then that's where you'll be using Copilot Studio, right? So Copilot Studio is especially, I would say, there's more and more kind of activity that's kind of moving towards that. So it's Copilot Studio Lite, you can't really do much, and so you kind of have to move to Copilot Studio. Copilot Studio is still in that low code realm, but there is more increased complexity there. And now you can now take models from Azure AI and move them back into Studio, right? So this is, I would say, more for people who have experience, I would say admin level experience, tech experience to some degree, some level of comfort with using technology. And so that's why that term makers is used. And so if you're looking for things like customer support, employee onboarding, employee assistance, all of those elements, they would sit very squarely in that Copilot Studio. Having said that, this is still, and again, Copilot Studio previously, if you understand Microsoft history, comes from Power Virtual Agent. So if you've used Power Virtual Agent, it's kind of the same thing without generative AI element, right? So that's been kind of thrown in. Now, the Azure AI element, I think, kind of takes it to the next level, right? So all of a sudden now you have a lot more control and you have a lot more complexity. You have a lot different cost implications. But what that also provides you to do is that you can actually start using AI beyond just that agentic element, right? So if you're looking at building some sort of models, if you're looking at analyzing text data, if you're looking at sentiment analysis, those actual AI applications, you can't do that with these first two. You will be actually looking at that Azure AI, right? Even from an agentic perspective, if you're looking at things like autonomous agents, so agents that can act on your behalf without you actually providing an input at any stage of time, X happens, and so take Y action, and you are not in that loop. More often than not, you are in that Azure AI, right? Whereas the task-based things, so if this happens, let me know, and then I can kind of kick off something else. So those are task-based agents. You are still working in Copilot Studio. And then if it's simple retrieval, so RAG, which is, provide me this information based on this set of sources, and that's properly within the Copilot Studio and Copilot Studio Lite. Right? So different use cases, different tool sets, and there's this element around figuring out what's a better fit. I will always say that I've had customers go the other way, and it takes a lot of time and takes a lot of effort and a lot of money. It is almost always better to go from left to right on my screen, right? So go start from Copilot Studio Lite, which will take you literally 10 minutes, to go to Copilot Studio, which might take you a day. And if you haven't met your outcomes and you are sure that generative AI is the tool set to meet those outcomes, then you can then start looking at Azure AI and those custom models and those custom engine agents, right? But if you spend a lot of time here and then you figure out that this was the right tool set, you're not going to get the time back, right? So it's a DevOps methodology that I kind of talk about here. It's the fail fast methodology, right? So you start there, you try it out. If it does the job that you're supposed to, awesome. If it doesn't, you're going to move on. So what can agents do, right? So first up, there's a bunch of agents. So if you have the Copilot MT65 Copilot subscription, you have a lot of these agents already. You should already have access to them. You should see them, right? And they are providing some of that functionality that Microsoft's already built out, right? So it's a really good idea to kind of start using them to see what you can do. They are also allowing you to focus on certain tasks. So you can use the project manager agent to help you track status and updates against a project plan, right? Or you can use the facilitator agent to run meetings in person and on Teams at the same time, right? So those elements are very particular, but these agents are already built out. You just, like, if you've got the MT65 Copilot piece, they include in your license, use them. Like researcher, amazing reasoning ability, right? So I used all the time when I'm looking. It takes a little bit of time to get there, but like it'll kind of come back to you and you can guide it along the journey, right? So these agents already exist. You should be going out and working with them. You don't need to do anything with them. So don't be building. There are also some agents that are already kind of there in the Copilot Studio piece. And this gives you a good idea in terms of where that complication is. So if you look on the left-hand side, that's the RAG piece, so pure retrieval. And then on the right-hand side are, I would say, that are those autonomous pieces. Then these agents would sit in that sphere, right? So the IT help desk agent, if it is just retrieving information from a knowledge base that already exists, yeah, it's fairly simple. It's a RAG, right? And you have an out-of-the-box connector with ServiceNow now. So I want to find out, if I have VPN issues, how do I reset my password, things like that. And once you get that integration in place with ServiceNow, I want to find out about the status of my ticket. I want to log a ticket. I want a list of all my tickets, all of those elements. So you've got that integration. So you've got that same interface that agent can sit wherever you want it to sit. But now you have that you're pulling from the knowledge source, which can be in ServiceNow, which can be on SharePoint, and you're also being able to actually do things, right? So that IT help desk agent is, and again, like I said, I used to do this. The time to value now on this is massively short. These are fairly short, sharp engagements where you can stand something up and start to see value very, very quickly on those, right? Um, Budget management agent. Now, this is integrating with either SharePoint repository or some sort of like a ERP kind of system to kind of look at what the open POs are, so that you can use that to do some sort of financial plan. And we've also created these agents for very, very unique use cases. I was looking at one that our team recently created around Wi-Fi sentiment analysis, right? So it's an agent that interacts with users for in-office settings to kind of gain their feedback around how they're experiencing Wi-Fi and what their requirements are versus how it's meeting that. So it's a very unique use case within that bigger IT realm. And again, like I said, because it's so easy to create those agents now and to kind of push them out and publish them. That's why we're kind of seeing a lot of these elements kind of work through. And where the example that we're going to use today is around things like employee onboarding. I've seen some questions come in. I want to make sure we have enough time for some of the stuff that I want to get through. So I will, time permitting, kind of try to address all of those questions then. So yeah, keep them coming. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'll try to tackle that, right? So what we're going to now talk about is effectively creating your first agent, right? So how can you do that? And it's like, again, like I said, it's an employee onboarding agent. We're going to go through the steps for it because of just the number of people that I have on the call. I've done that before. We didn't want to do a live demo, but what I'll do is I'll kind of talk through some of those elements that are not covered or that I think need special attention. Again, like I said, we're not going to be able to cover everything, but yeah, I'll try to kind of work through those as we kind of go through this, right? So we're going to play a video and then we're going to talk about some of those elements, right, in terms of creating that agent piece. So yeah, I think I'll just kind of pause and kind of dig deeper into that piece around the knowledge piece. So one key element to understand, and again, we talked about that power virtualization piece. you do have the ability to work off the generative AI, and you also have the ability to work off the generative AI, right? So there are scenarios where you don't want generative AI to be contributing to your knowledge sources, right? We worked recently with the police department, which are using agents to provide guidance on SOPs to agents in the field, right? So these are law enforcement agents. Now, obviously, in those scenarios, you don't want generative AI to contribute anything that might be problematic, right? And so in those cases, the term that's used is that classic orchestration, right? And what it does is that it's executing these explicitly authored topics with fixed steps, right? The fallbacks. So if it doesn't really meet those, um, they are also kind of very predictable. The agent is behaving in a fully controlled behavior, and so if you're working in a compliance heavy scenario, if you've got a regulated environment, you want to actually not be working in the generative piece. You want to be working from a classic perspective, right? And so if you've got simple repetitive tasks, if you're looking at FAQs, if you're looking at form submissions, you are going to be looking at the classic one. There's also a pricing connotation there. And, and so it's important to understand that even with using Copilot Studio, you could be not using AI, right? Uh, if you've got legacy processes, if you've got structured workflows, all of those elements, anything that needs deterministic response. So for the same set of inputs, the same set of outputs are respond, you will actually be working on the classic one. The generative one is the one that is AI powered, right? So it is dynamic. It uses LLMs to understand intent and context. And then it can handle responses on the fly, right? So it is non-deterministic. So for the same set of inputs, you will receive different outputs. It will do clarifying questions automatically. It will try to respond to complex inquiries, to new things, all of those elements, right? It is not suitable for your strict compliance scenarios. And so if you're looking for those multi-step interactions, if you're looking for human-like conversations, if you're looking for scenarios that require flexibility and learning, then that's where you're going to use. So those knowledge sources that video just mentioned, they kind of have to map to that, right? Um, so if you are willing those knowledge sources to be a starting point of sorts, and then for generative AI to kind of fill in the gaps, then those knowledge sources are going to be very different than if they are all encompassing, and that's where you want to kind of get them to be restricted. And so that's the classic piece, right? So again, generative versus classic, and the knowledge sources that need to echo that. So there has to be a process around knowledge curation that goes into your agent based on that, right? Now, the second piece around this is in terms of what are those knowledge sources. So just again, that generative piece is called conversational boosting. So and we'll talk about topics, if by default they kind of turned on. So if the bot doesn't find a suitable response from the knowledge sources that you uploaded, then it's going to try to go to the web and try to get your response. That is the conversational boosting piece, right? So if you see that conversational boosting piece, that's where it's coming from. Now, from the sources perspective, it's very important to recognize who's going to be using the bot, right? So if you've got a bot that's going to be publicly available, we've worked with municipalities where they've kind of got a bot sitting on their website. You can kind of go in and talk about setting up a tourist itinerary or get more information on permits or just even the finances, all of those pieces. Those are very public bots. And so then there isn't any authentication piece that's built. So they're public, anyone can kind of access them, right? The internal bots, on the other hand, will have authentication because I need to ensure that whoever's interacting with them has the right credentials, right? So if it's an employee, they need to be part of my Active Directory and all of those things. So and then just also from an authentication perspective, it's also significant because the information that the agent is bringing up is going to be specific for access that the user has access to. So if you, for example, created a SharePoint repository that has multiple documents, and I, Shahab, as a user, have access to 5 of those 10 documents, when my bot responds back to me, it's going to base its response only on those 5 and not all 10, right? And so the only way it can do that is through authentication to ensure the fact that it knows I have access to only 5 rather than those 10, and then it can work off those, right? Um, it's also important to understand the limitations around each of those elements, and also understand how these kind of work. These limitations have been expanded, but you will still find issues if you've got extremely tabular data, if you've got these massive documents, if you've got image heavy data, the bots actually don't do well. Copilot Studio bots don't do well with those, right? So especially around unstructured data elements, the different limits and limitations. I can actually, let me see if I can do that. I'll try to kind of just put that link in, so that you have that, right? So just make sure you understand that piece before you kind of go into it. And then the number of inputs that are supported, again, it's different between the generative piece and the classic piece. Um, what what you can do. It's also, especially with SharePoint, in terms of the levels of depth that you can go to, that's also something that's changed. It used to be formerly just 2 depth. So there's only certain specificity that you can kind of introduce into it, right? So I would say figure those pieces out. For the same set of knowledge sources, there are different ways of attaching them to the agent. So for example, you could take those documents from your SharePoint and attach them as a particular document. You could take those documents, take that information, put it in a database, and you can take that SharePoint repository and kind of attach it to your agent. Each of those will provide different results. I know it sounds hard to believe, but it will provide different results. So just you want to kind of experiment with that a little bit to figure out which one works the best, before you kind of get into it. Okay. Let's go into a little bit, in terms of, so we've talked a lot about the knowledge basis piece. Let's talk about how you kind of, how the bots work, and how that kind of, those topics kind of get pulled in, and how you write those topics. So just we'll kind of go into slightly more depth around the topics piece. So topics is effectively the back end of your bot, right? So that's where you're kind of designing your bot. You kind of heard about that fallback piece, which is that conversation boosting piece. So if it doesn't have that information available readily, you can then have it access out to generative AI. That's where we talked about the classic versus generative piece. It might not always be the best idea for it to kind of use generative AI to respond. There is, I would say, we've kind of worked through a bunch of these bots, and so there's this. I wanted to kind of just put together some of those, um, authoring best practices, um, and I think that effective topic authoring is essential in terms of how that experiences between those conversational agents. And then also from a backend perspective, I think it's very important in terms of how you're able to keep track of things, make these bots maintainable, scalable, right? Um, and so the first piece that I want to kind of cover, and I think this is more both from a technology perspective and then from an administration perspective, is the fact that you want to be keeping these topics fairly small. The large topics can be difficult to manage and update, and just uh, if you have to make changes with them, it's for someone else to kind of look through them and kind of understand that logic, that becomes hard. And so if you just try to make them smaller, the other pieces, make them reusable, right? So make that reusable piece, make that logic easier to follow. The smaller topics, they can be triggered independently, right? So you could kind of have those topics kind of pop up in different flows at different points in time. And so you can use them in that granular manner and kind of have that model design. Um, um, the other piece is with those reuse topics, you're avoiding that duplication piece. You're ensuring that consistency in responses from the bot to the human. So just from and you're also training people to kind of interact with those bots, right? So if there's inconsistency there, that kind of also makes an issue for the users who are interacting. And then also if you're trying to update pieces, you kind of just change the topic, and then once it's reused, it's going to propagate all the same way. The next piece is in terms of avoiding topic overlaps. So what is effectively happening is that based on that user input, it's kind of directing to one topic versus the other. You do when you have multiple kind of topics share similar triggers, it can kind of lead to misrouting. And the example that I give is, if I talk about time off or time, it can mean many different things within an agent, right? So if it's an HR piece, it can mean something around time off, or it can mean about time zones, or it can mean particular duration of time, particular point of time. So that disambiguation needs to happen from an author, so ourselves, as we're kind of writing out these spots, right? And you do have the option of using these disambiguation topics that ask clarifying questions and then route users to the appropriate topics based on the responses, right? So for example, if there is something small around time, you can be like, hey, are you looking to book a vacation, or are you looking for, I don't know, Houston time zone conversion or something, right? So just kind of having those in place helps a lot. And then having entities and slot filling kind of enhances that user experience by extracting that key information from user. So this makes those kind of conversations more efficient. You also want to plan for multiple entry points. So utterances are in terms of what is being said, but a set of utterances can kind of lead to the same topic. And if there is behavioral elements that we need to kind of recognize, periods of inactivity, how do you kind of tackle that? So providing that flexibility in those conversations, I think, is key. And then the last piece around topics, which is not even on the slide, it's that iterating and validating piece. So I would almost actually effectively with users, we've done that with agents, where we'll kind of read those dialogues aloud and kind of help identify issues around tone or clarity. And then even looked at some of those user analytics and kind of compared them to transcripts. So kind of just work through those disambiguation pieces. So if the bot isn't able to understand what the user is saying, and you're beginning to see a correlation between the transcript and the interactions there, well, there's something that you need to fix, right? So just these practices, I think, as a whole, kind of ensure that your agents are more robust, they're more user friendly, and they're more responsive and effective, right? So they're kind of getting the users to the outcome that they need as quickly as possible. You don't want to frustrate them through it. You want them to kind of work all that in. We won't be talking about handoffs, but if that's the case, then we can kind of do those handoffs for you. So kind of let's go into the tools piece, and then we'll talk about those generative elements also. So yeah, you've kind of now effectively, I would say, seen those elements, right? So we kind of created those flows, we put those in, and then there's that action piece. So this is a task-based agent. So based on certain elements, it's going to go ahead and kind of take a set of tasks. You also have that ability to author custom prompts to configure instructions. And you can add these custom prompts. You would have seen that in the tool set, either at the agent level or at the topic level, right? And so there's this prompt editor that will allow you to create and customize and test those prompt templates. So effectively, your agent can call those prompts and kind of take actions around that. And that prompt editor kind of lets you write your prompt. You can write them manually. You can ask Copilot to generate instructions for you based on your description of what you prompt to do. Or you can kind of use something from the prompt library. And then you can also configure several aspects of that prompt, right? So you can choose the sharp model that you want to use for that prompt. You can use settings for knowledge retrieval. You want to have links in that response, and then knowledge sources from like things like database tables, all of those elements, and then the formatting to apply the output. So when you've kind of done that prompt, you can kind of test it by specifying sample data, and then you can use a topic to kind of call these prompts, right? So as you're in that flow, you can then effectively call other prompts to kind of take some of those actions. We'll just go through one last piece. We're kind of a little bit behind. We'll talk about the publishing piece, and I'll just talk about one element around publishing and where it can become available. And then we'll kind of so just when it was kind of talking about those pieces around channels, I think there's one that it didn't really mention. I kind of want to mention. So as you're kind of developing it, you do have the ability to kind of test these out in real time. You can test them out on a demo website. Just like nothing that you need to do, you can just literally launch it from Copilot Studio. Again, because we've seen issues with that, you should only be using the demo website if you're still in that development phase, right? You want people to try out that agent. It is not meant for production users, and that kind of creates issues. Once it's ready to go, you should always publish it. Because then, and every time you make changes to it, you should republish it. And it just, there is that difference. I've seen some production environments that have had demo website launches. I don't think that's something that we recommend. Right? Now, there was, I think there was some discussion around agents and where you can use them and how you can use them. So just understand that you don't need the M365 Copilot license necessarily to consume agents. It is fairly complicated, but you do. So actually, maybe even backing up here. Anyone and everyone who has an Entra ID has access to Copilot Chat. Now, once you have access to Copilot Chat, you can also get access to Copilot agents. One way to pay for them is if you have the MT65 Copilot license, which is $30 US. But then there's also pay-as-you-go models or message packs. And those are, if you have those Azure subscriptions, that's how you're going to be able to pay for them, right? You can enable them in your Copilot chat piece, right? So you'll see on the slide that I have there in terms of how you kind of enable those agents, the default settings on those, and then where you need to change them. The control piece is fairly complicated. And I would not take it lightly, both from a security perspective and from billing and governance perspective. But just, I would say for the purpose of this webinar, you need to understand that you need to kind of enable it through your admin center and the Power Platform admin center as well. And then again, like I said, you can give the Copilot chat. So this is again the free one. Users the ability to create an agent from that MT65 Copilot piece. Or through Copilot Studio, you need to make sure that you want to give users those rights, because they can create agents. Then how are you ensuring that happens sustainably? What happens around the life cycle around these agents? How do you not have a bunch of orphan agents kind of? So again, all of those rights can be managed through the Microsoft Admin Center. You can also manage the Copilot Studio capacity for agents in the Power Platform Admin Center, right? So those controls all exist. You don't need the MT65 Copilot license for them, but you do need to do that work to figure out how you're going to use them, right? All right. So so there's a lot happening in this space. I couldn't possibly cover this, but I did want to kind of leave you guys with the exciting news, which is, I think, just really, really cool. There was some kind of, I would say, controversy around that. And that's this computer use tool that is going to come out. It's actually already available in US in Copilot Studio, that allows agents to interact with both websites and desktop apps by clicking buttons, selecting menus, typing fields in a screen. And so it uses vision, right? So using AI vision. So effectively, it's just like how a customer or user would kind of do things. It could be a bunch of different things. Could be around things like data processing. It could even be things like research and analysis. You can have an agent do that on your behalf. And you can have that done multiple times on like a bunch of different machines. And it could be like a cloud-based thing, or it could be something that the customer has. So, like if you're looking at things like automated data entry, if you're looking at invoice processing, right? If you're looking to, for example, extract certain information from a set of invoices, then input it into accounting systems, and then streamline the entire invoicing process to kind of reduce the manual errors, you can effectively do that. You can write a flow for it. You can have an agent do that on your behalf, right? You're looking at some sort of market research. Um, your marketing team can kind of automate that collection of market data from different online sources. You can do it manually once and then kind of follow that through, right? So it's just very much, I think, just from the extent of what you can do with agents, I think this is going to be a bit of a game changer, right? I want to talk about now. I know we've talked quite a few things. We haven't covered everything, but I did want to kind of cover um, our look at where agents kind of fit into that broader picture from a customer journey perspective, right? And I think it is restrictive to kind of have this in 2D because I think a single organization will go through the same journey at different times in different ways. Uh, so initially, every organization kind of is going to start on that technical readiness piece, and you might actually start in that empty 65% productivity piece, but you might actually also start on the business process piece, right? So, like I talked about, some of those cities and those elements around having those bots that sit on their websites, they actually went on that business process piece that I started off on the agent piece stuff first. And so their technical readiness is slightly different than what it would be from a user perspective from personal productivity piece, right? But at this point in time, you're just trying to understand whichever copilot you're considering or the way you're considering it, what you need to know. So just kind of getting a high level overview, making sure everyone within all the stakeholders are in the same on the same page in terms of understanding all the considerations. And then the next phase that I'll kind of talk about, for this one, we kind of are talking about the MT65 Copilot, is that Kickstarter phase where you are trying to look for quick wins, right? You're looking for that business value. You're looking at those scenarios where MT65 Copilot in particular can help and trying to figure out the business value against those, right? So it's creating that business case of sorts. Here are some of the things that I think MT65 Copilot can help on. This is the cost for them for my organization. If I have MT65 Copilot do those for me, I save X amount of money while investing Y amount in those licenses. So kind of creating those pieces and kind of having that conversation. What we've seen right after that is that a lot of organizations would right after that go into that governance, compliance, security piece. And this journey could be, it is very customized and it can go from weeks to months, multiple months, right? And these are elements around your Copilot control system. So as I talked about, how do you control agents and creation of agents and who has access to agents and how much of that capacity is available to those users, who's mentioning those life cycles, but then also more foundational. What does my SharePoint environment look like? Do I have the necessary data security guardrails in there where those agents are going to access that information and that's completely accessible to me, or even the MT65 Copilot piece? I have SAM available to me. So SharePoint Advanced Management is now part of MT65 Copilot license. How can I use that to improve the health of my SharePoint environment? And then from a file data perspective, how does preview figure into it? So all of those elements, I think, are kind of part of that security piece, compliance piece, governance piece. Every organization is different in terms of where they are, but I think getting ahead of them and trying to figure that out is key, right? And then once you kind of figure that out, you might already be experimenting with some Copilot licenses, but then you kind of want to do a bigger launch of sorts, have a few departments kind of using it. You've identified the use cases, you figured out you're safe to do so. And now I think is the hardest part. Everything else that I've talked about, I think is the easy part, right? Security, you'll figure out, capability, you'll figure out, business, you'll figure out. I think the hardest part starts now because now it's about change management and adoption. Could have done everything right, but if no one's using it, then there's no value there, right? And so there's where that end user training kind of comes into it. We have a very advanced champion program that we take customers through. And then the analytics piece, right? So it's okay to kind of put all of those training mechanisms in place, but to understand what's working, what's not working. Every organization is different, user base is different, appetite for change is different, right? How do we kind of work through that? And then if it doesn't work, what happens, right? So kind of picking those pieces up. And then the next piece there is once you have people using it, they will then discover use cases on their own. So how do you tackle that? And so that's where the discussion that we've had today around agents begins to make sense, right? So we talked about that employee onboarding piece. Ideally, you want that to come from your HR team who are onboarding people and kind of spending those resources on. You don't want it to be a IT-led initiative where IT is kind of going to HR and saying, "Hey, look what this agent can do." You want to enable HR to that degree around Copilot and around generative AI, where they'll still kind of make those decisions in conjunction with you, but they understand enough to kind of say, "Hey, I think this is a use case for generative AI where it can help around agentic piece." Right? And then the next piece, I've talked about some of the specialized solutions, right? So I talked about that police department, talked about the municipality piece, I talked about the website Wi-Fi sentiment analysis. Now these are specialized solutions. They might extend beyond what we talked about in studio because you might be integrating with things like Fabric, you might be integrating with things on the cloud, you've got Azure AI elements, you've got third-party tool sets like Salesforce and ServiceNow. Um, and that's when you begin to become an AI organization. So if you go back to the start of my presentation where I kind of talked about how AI-powered organizations exist. AI-powered organizations exist not in these silos, but when these different systems are talking to each other and have AI underpin some of those interactions, right? And so those specialized solutions are coming in, and there's that successful adoption. So yeah, so I would say that's the journey that we're kind of taking some of those customers through. We've got customers who have kind of in different phases as we've kind of gone through that piece. Um, there is the way kind of Microsoft looks at it is there's the Power Copilot, and so they've kind of brought the whole Power platform together with Copilot. So things like Power Apps, Power BI, all of those elements are now well within, and I think it's a logical piece. So Copilot Studios, Power Virtual Agent, all of those elements are now kind of sitting together. So if you have any initiatives where you're kind of trying to look at envisioning, POCs, all of those elements, if you're looking at deploy them, and then if you're looking at specialized solutions. The first two also have these dollar signs because for under certain requirements, Microsoft will fund those pieces. And those pieces can be anything. These pieces can be around project management, it could be around business analysis, it could be around solution development, it could be around immersion training adoption, right? So everything that you see on the screen. So any of those elements that can contribute to that, Microsoft's willing to fund those again under certain conditions, right? I will pause here. I will go back to the questions and see if I can tackle some of those now. Um, so do you need Copilot license for business in order to use agents? I think I've answered that. You just need, if you have an Enter ID, you have access to Copilot. You should have that. We actually literally, like I said, 2 months ago, did a webinar just to tell you guys how you could enable Copilot chat in your environment safely, securely. What are some of the things that you need to look at? You should definitely do that. It is free of charge. However, when you start enabling agents and using agents, that has a cost implication, which I talked about. It's either pay-as-you-go model or you can buy message packs. Um, so the AI agent within SharePoint versus the one in Copilot Studio, the the underlying capabilities around these agents is is not a singular capability. There's quite a few different things that are happening underneath the covers. Um, so the way they approach search, for example, is different with SharePoint, with agents in SharePoint versus through Copilot Studio. I will just, again, I think it's a bigger conversation, Joanna. So if you want to maybe reach out to your CDW sales rep, we can go into more detail. At its base, I would say just the major difference is in terms of where you start, right? So with SharePoint, you are actually starting with that knowledge base. And so you kind of take that knowledge base and make that the basis of the agent that you write around it. Whereas in Copilot Studio, you kind of write the agent and then add knowledge bases to it. On the surface of it, it should be identical. It is not identical because of the other elements. So elements like reasoning, elements like how search work are slightly different. You will also see those variations in terms of, again, what you do with the knowledge sources within Copilot Studio. So like I said, so if you point to the same set of data as files in SharePoint and you point that SharePoint repository to Copilot Studio, it will be different than if you take that same file and attach it directly as a knowledge source versus take that same set of data and put it in Dataverse. You will see different responses and you will see different results. It is something that you kind of figure out from an iteration perspective. And there are some best practices that we can kind of talk about on, and it will take more than the next couple of minutes. Um, any other questions that I can tackle? I'm going to I was trying to kind of go quickly to give you guys back time. Any other questions that I can tackle? All right, awesome. Um, thank you so much for stopping by. Thank you so much for giving me the time and hearing me out. And I hope this was useful. Again, like I said, it's 1 hour is not maybe enough to kind of go through these in greater detail. If you have more questions, do reach out to your CW rep, and we'll be more than willing to kind of go into more depth with your use case in particular. And yeah, I hope you have an amazing rest of your day and happy weekend. Just go one more. Thank you so much, folks. Take care. Bye.